The moment I stepped into the forest, a chill ran down my spine. I couldn't quite place it. The air felt heavy, thicker than it should for a midsummer evening. The leaves rustled in a way that felt unnatural. Still, I chalked it up to paranoia. After all, I'd been hiking these trails for years. This particular stretch of forest, though dense, had always been serene and unthreatening. But something was different today. I had come out here alone, needing some peace to clear my mind. Work had been stressful, life chaotic, and hiking always gave me a sense of calm. So when the trailhead came into view, I had eagerly plunged into the woods. The sun was just beginning to set, casting long shadows that stretched eerily across the path. As I made my way deeper into the forest, the usual sounds of chirping birds and insects seemed to fade. The only sound now was the crunch of leaves beneath my boots. The trees loomed overhead, their branches intertwining like the gnarled fingers of ancient giants. It felt as if the forest was alive, watching me, waiting for something. About an hour in, I realized that the trail had become less familiar. The markers I usually relied on were nowhere to be seen, and I hadn't come across another hiker in a while. I stopped to check my map, but as I unfolded it, a gust of wind tore it from my hands. I watched, helpless, as it fluttered away into the underbrush. Great, I muttered under my breath, a sinking feeling settling in. I debated turning back, but I was stubborn, always pushing forward. I could find my way without the map. I'd done it before. The deeper I went, the darker it became. The sun had dipped below the horizon now, and the forest seemed to swallow the light. Shadows danced between the trees, making the familiar path seem alien and distorted. My flashlight, dimmer than I remembered, flickered briefly before stabilizing. That's when I heard a soft rustling in the bushes behind me. I froze, straining to hear. My heart began to thump loudly in my chest, a heavy, uncomfortable rhythm. Probably just a deer, I told myself, though my voice wavered. The rustling came again, closer this time. I turned, shining my flashlight toward the sound. Nothing. Just a sea of black trees and tangled vines. I tried to shake off the unease, but it clung to me like the damp air. I pressed on, my steps quicker now, more determined. But the deeper I went, the stranger the forest became. The trees, once tall and majestic, now seemed crooked, their bark blackened and twisted, as if scorched by some ancient fire. The air grew colder, and a dense fog began to creep in, swirling around my ankles. As I moved through the fog, I stumbled upon something, a clearing. At first, I thought it might be a good sign, a way to get my bearings. But then I saw it. In the center of the clearing stood an old, decrepit cabin. Its wooden planks were rotted, the windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes staring back at me. The roof sagged, and the front door hung slightly ajar. I felt an overwhelming urge to run, but something about the cabin pulled me toward it. It was as if the forest had led me here, guiding me to this very spot. Against my better judgment, I approached. The door creaked as I pushed it open, revealing a dimly lit interior. The air inside was musty, and the floorboards groaned under my weight. I shone my flashlight around the room, revealing old, decaying furniture covered in dust. In the corner, a fireplace lay cold and unused, a strange, charred symbol etched into the stone above it. That's when I saw them footprints. They weren't mine, and they weren't fresh. They were small, almost childlike, and led from the doorway deeper into the cabin. My heart raced as I followed them, every step feeling heavier, more reluctant. The footprints stopped in front of a door at the far end of the room, a cellar door. I hesitated, my breath catching in my throat. Something told me not to open it, to turn back now while I still could. But my hand moved on its own, gripping the rusted handle. Slowly, I pulled the door open, revealing a steep staircase leading down into complete darkness. A foul stench wafted up from the depths, making my stomach churn. I held my breath, shining the flashlight down the stairs. At the bottom, something moved a shadow, quick and skittering. I took a step back, but it was too late. A loud bang echoed through the cabin as the front door slammed shut behind me. My heart leaped into my throat as I spun around, shining the flashlight toward the entrance. But there was no one there. Suddenly, the temperature dropped. My breath came out in visible puffs as I felt a presence behind me. Slowly, I turned back toward the cellar, but the shadow was gone. In its place, something began to climb the stairs, slow and deliberate. A scraping sound filled the air, like nails dragging across the wooden steps. I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. My legs felt like lead, frozen in place as the figure emerged from the darkness. It wasn't human. Pale, gaunt, and hunched over, the thing crawled on all fours, its eyes black and empty. Its mouth hung open in a twisted grin, revealing sharp, yellowed teeth. It dragged itself closer, its long, bony fingers scratching at the floor as it moved. I stumbled back, my flashlight flickering wildly as I fumbled for the door, but it was no use. The door wouldn't budge, locked from the outside. The creature was inches away now, its rancid breath hot against my skin. In a final, desperate attempt, I swung my flashlight at it, but it passed right through, like striking smoke. I screamed as the creature lunged at me, its mouth opening impossibly wide. Darkness enveloped me, and the last thing I heard before everything went silent was the sound of my own heartbeat slowing, fading into the void. I never should have come into the forest alone. I had always loved hiking, especially in the more remote parts of the forest where the trails were less trodden, the air fresher, and the silence unbroken. There was something about being completely alone in the wilderness that appealed to me. It was freedom, a break from the clutter of modern life. So when I discovered a new trail deep within the woods, one that wasn't marked on any of the maps, I didn't hesitate. I figured it would be a chance to explore something untouched by other hikers. As soon as I stepped off the known path, the trees closed in around me, their branches forming a canopy so thick that even the sunlight struggled to break through. It was as though I had stepped into another world, one where time moved differently, slower. At first, the trail was easy to follow, just a narrow, winding path between the trees, covered in fallen leaves. My footsteps echoed softly in the stillness, and I found myself enjoying the solitude. But as I continued, the path began to change. The ground became uneven, the leaves thicker, hiding roots that threatened to trip me with every step. The trees, too, seemed to grow closer together, their trunks gnarled and twisted in strange ways. I checked my phone, no signal. That didn't surprise me. I was deep in the woods by now. I wasn't worried, though. I had a compass, and I knew how to retrace my steps if needed. But then I noticed something strange. The birds had stopped singing. The forest was dead silent. No rustling of leaves in the wind, no distant calls of wildlife, nothing. I stopped, listening. All I could hear was the sound of my own breathing, growing a little more uneasy by the second. It was like the forest itself was holding its breath, waiting for something. I shook off the creeping anxiety and pressed on. The trail had become more overgrown now, the trees thicker, their branches twisting in odd directions like the outstretched arms of some deformed creature. The air grew damp, and the smell of earth and rot became stronger. I told myself I was just being paranoid, that it was just an overgrown part of the forest I hadn't seen before. But as I moved forward, something else became apparent. The path was changing. No longer was it a simple trail carved through the woods. The ground was muddy now, slick with moisture, and the trees, they were wrong. Their bark was blackened, as though charred by fire, yet there was no smell of smoke. The leaves overhead had turned a sickly yellow, despite it being summer. Then I noticed the carvings. At first, they were subtle, small, shallow etchings in the bark of the trees. But as I walked, they became more frequent and more intricate, strange symbols, spirals, and runes I didn't recognize. They looked old, ancient, even as if they had been there long before any hiker had set foot in these woods. A chill ran down my spine. I wanted to turn back, but when I glanced over my shoulder, the path behind me seemed to have changed, too. It looked darker, more twisted, and the symbols on the trees seemed to have multiplied. Panic gripped me, but I forced myself to breathe. I just needed to keep calm. I could still find my way out. I continued forward, hoping to find something familiar, but the forest had transformed into a labyrinth. The trees seemed to shift when I wasn't looking, their branches reaching out like skeletal fingers. The symbols on the trunks now glowed faintly in the dim light, casting eerie shadows that danced along the ground. My footsteps quickened, though I didn't know where I was going anymore. The path had vanished completely, swallowed by the forest. Every turn I took led to more twisted trees, more glowing symbols, and the oppressive silence grew heavier. Then I heard a faint whisper. At first, I thought it was the wind, but there was no wind. The whisper was soft, barely audible, but unmistakably there. It seemed to come from all directions at once, wrapping around me like a cold breeze. I stopped in my tracks, heart pounding in my chest. The whispering grew louder, though I still couldn't make out the words. It was like a chorus of voices overlapping, speaking in a language I didn't understand. I turned in a circle, shining my flashlight into the trees, but saw nothing. Then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. It was quick, darting between the trees, just at the edge of the light. I spun around, trying to catch a glimpse of whatever it was, but it moved too fast. My breathing became shallow, my palms slick with sweat as I gripped the flashlight tighter. "Hello," I called out, my voice sounding small and pathetic in the vastness of the woods. "Is anyone there?" No response. Only the whispering, growing louder now, more insistent. I started walking faster, almost jogging, but no matter which way I went, the forest only seemed to grow denser, the trees closer, the symbols brighter. My legs felt heavy, like I was wading through thick mud, though the ground was dry. Panic clawed at my chest. I had no idea where I was, no idea how to get back. Suddenly, the whispering stopped. For a moment, The silence was deafening, oppressive. Then, from the darkness ahead, I saw a figure, barely visible in the dim light. It stood motionless between two twisted trees, watching me. I froze, my heart hammering in my chest. The figure was tall, its outline human but wrong in some way. Its limbs were too long, its posture unnaturally stiff. It didn't move, didn't make a sound, but I could feel its eyes on me, piercing through the darkness. I took a step back, my flashlight flickering. The figure remained still. I took another step, then another, my movements slow and deliberate, as though any sudden motion would provoke it. My back hit the trunk of a tree, and for a second, I thought I was trapped. Then, without warning, the figure lunged. It moved impossibly fast, a blur of black against the shadows. I turned and ran, heart pounding in my ears. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees reaching out to grab me, the symbols flashing like fireflies in the night. I could hear the figure behind me, its footsteps silent but ever present, growing closer. I didn't stop running until I burst through the trees and stumbled onto a familiar path. My legs were burning, my chest heaving, but I didn't dare look back. I ran until the trees thinned out, until the sky opened up above me, and the sounds of the normal forest returned. When I finally stopped, gasping for air, I turned around. The figure was gone, but I could still hear the whispering, faint and distant, echoing through the trees. And somehow, I knew I would never truly escape. I've always been drawn to the quiet of the forest where the world falls away, and it's just me and the trees. There's a peace in the solitude, the kind that lets my mind breathe. That's why, one Saturday morning, I decided to hike a trail I hadn't explored before. It was a bit off the grid, no official markings, no signs of regular foot traffic, just the kind of place I loved. The first few hours were bliss. The sky was overcast, but the air was crisp, and the towering trees seemed to hold a comforting silence. As I ventured deeper into the forest, I noticed that the trail became narrower, the trees thicker. The usual sounds of birds and rustling leaves began to fade until all that was left was the crunch of my boots on the underbrush. After a while, I stopped for a drink of water, taking in the view of the dense forest around me. That's when I noticed something odd, a faint trail branching off to the right, barely noticeable beneath the thick layer of leaves. It looked less like a path and more like something had been dragged through the undergrowth. Intrigued, I decided to follow it. The deeper I went, the stranger things became. The trees were different here, their bark dark and gnarled, almost as if they had been burned but without any sign of fire. The air felt cooler, and the silence that had once been peaceful now felt suffocating. There was no wind, no movement, just an eerie stillness that made me feel like I was being watched. I should have turned back, but something about the path compelled me forward. That's when I saw them carvings in the trees. They were crude, symbols etched into the bark with what looked like a sharp stone or blade, spirals, lines, and shapes I couldn't make sense of. They felt wrong, ancient, like they didn't belong in this world. I traced one of the carvings with my fingers, and for a moment, I thought I felt the bark pulse beneath my touch. A chill crept up my spine. The farther I went, the more carvings appeared, each one more elaborate than the last. Soon, they were on every tree I passed, glowing faintly as if something was trapped beneath the surface, trying to break free. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, but I couldn't stop. My feet moved on their own, each step heavier than the last. Then, the trail ended. I found myself in a small clearing surrounded by trees that seemed to loom closer than before. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, ancient and weathered, with more of those strange carvings covering its surface. A low mist clung to the ground, swirling around my feet. The air felt thick, almost oppressive. That's when I heard it, a whisper. It wasn't clear, more like the rustle of leaves, but the words were there, hidden beneath the sound. I looked around, but I was alone. The whisper grew louder, like it was circling me, though nothing moved. My heart raced, and I took a step back, feeling an overwhelming urge to run, but my legs felt glued to the ground. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw something move, a shadow, tall and thin, darting between the trees at the edge of the clearing. My breath caught in my throat as I watched it flicker in and out of sight, faster than anything human. The whispering grew frantic, almost angry, the words blending into a dissonant hum that made my head pound. The shadow moved again, closer this time. I turned and ran, stumbling over roots and rocks as the forest seemed to close in around me. The trees blurred, the carvings glowing brighter as if they were alive, watching me flee. My lungs burned, but I didn't stop. I didn't dare. I could feel it behind me, the shadow, always just a step away. The whispering never stopped, even as I burst through the treeline and into the safety of daylight. I didn't stop running until I reached my car, heart pounding and legs trembling. When I finally dared to look back at the forest, it was still, silent, but the whispering, faint, almost imperceptible, followed me all the way home.
The forest was known among locals as a place of whispers and shadows, a haunting realm where few dared to tread. Legends spoke of the dark rituals once performed deep within its depths, rites designed to summon forces far beyond human comprehension. People often warn newcomers to steer clear, but the allure of the unknown was too tempting for a group of friends seeking adventure. One chilly autumn evening, Jake, Ethan, and Tyler gathered for a camping trip. They had heard the rumors and were intrigued, wanting to prove their bravery and uncover the secrets hidden within the forest. As dusk settled in, they set up their tents in a small clearing. "Are you sure we should do this?" Jake asked, glancing around as the wind rustled the leaves, almost as if the forest was alive. "Come on, man. It's just a story." Ethan laughed. "Let's get this ritual going." Tyler pulled out a small, tattered book he had found online, its pages filled with strange symbols and incantations. "I found this online. It's supposed to be an ancient ritual for protection," he explained. As the sun dipped below the horizon, the forest darkened, shadows stretching ominously. The three friends gathered around the fire, feeling a mix of thrill and unease as they recited the words from the book. They believed they were just playing with myths, but the air around them shifted, a heavy tension settling over the clearing. The wind began to howl, and the flames flickered erratically, casting eerie shapes on the trees. Suddenly, a loud crack echoed through the forest. "What was that?" Tyler stammered, his bravado faltering. "I don't know," Jake replied, scanning the dark woods surrounding them. The laughter and chatter that had filled the air moments ago faded into an uncomfortable silence. Undeterred, Ethan urged them to continue. "We're fine. It's all in our heads," he reassured. They resumed the ritual, chanting louder, their voices rising above the wind. As they spoke the final incantation, a deafening silence fell. The wind ceased, and an unnatural stillness enveloped the forest. Suddenly, the ground beneath them trembled, and shadows began to swirl around the clearing. A chilling figure emerged from the darkness, a grotesque amalgamation of limbs and features, its eyes glowing with a malevolent light. The friends froze, their hearts racing as they realized the horror of what they had summoned. "What did we do?" Ethan stumbled. "We need to leave now." But it was too late. The figure lunged toward them, a guttural growl resonating through the air. The friends ran in different directions, fear driving them to escape the darkness that threatened to consume them. Jake sprinted deeper into the forest, branches clawing at his skin as he fled. He could hear the heavy breathing of the entity behind him, growing closer with each step. He glanced back, heart racing, but the darkness enveloped everything. The shadows danced around him, disorienting him as he tried to navigate the twisted paths. Ethan had managed to find his way back to the clearing, but the figure had followed him, blocking the path. With nowhere to go, he pressed against a tree. The creature was unlike anything he had ever seen. Its twisted form was a nightmare made flesh. Tyler, meanwhile, had found an old cabin hidden beneath the dense trees. Desperately, he pushed the door open and stumbled inside. The air was thick with the smell of decay, but he hoped it would provide some sanctuary. He leaned against the wall, trying to catch his breath, but a creeping dread filled the room. Suddenly, the door creaked open, revealing the creature standing silhouetted in the doorway. Tyler's heart sank as he realized he was trapped. He turned to flee deeper into the cabin, but the creature was too quick, closing the distance between them. Meanwhile, Jake had fallen to his knees, overwhelmed with fear and regret. He could feel the darkness creeping closer, swallowing the last remnants of light. In that moment, he realized the truth. The ritual had gone horribly wrong, and they had summoned something that was never meant to be unleashed. Ethan heard Jake's terrified screams echoing through the trees and felt a surge of desperation. He knew they had to regroup, but the creature was relentless. As he fought to find his way back, he stumbled upon Tyler's abandoned flashlight, flickering weakly on the forest floor. Gathering his courage, Ethan picked it up and shone it into the darkness, hoping to find his friends. "Jake! Tyler!" he called out. In that moment of desperation, Jake and Ethan's paths crossed again. They saw each other in the distance, both pale and shaken. But just as they were about to reunite, the creature lunged at Jake, its dark form consuming him in an instant. Ethan screamed. "Tyler!" he shouted, but the forest seemed to shift, the trees closing in, making it impossible to navigate. As Ethan stumbled forward, he felt the oppressive weight of darkness closing in around him. "You shouldn't have come here," they seemed to say. The last thing he saw, was the glowing eyes of the creature before everything went black. The forest stood still once more, the echoes of laughter and screams swallowed by the night. The dark ritual had claimed its victims, leaving only the whispers of the damned behind. It was the dead of winter, and the forecast had warned of an intense snowstorm moving in. Most people in town were already home, bundled up, fireplaces lit, waiting for the storm to pass. But not Sam. He was still miles away, driving his old truck through empty country roads, trying to make it home before the blizzard hit full force. He had left work later than planned, and now the snow was coming down faster than he expected. The windshield wipers struggled to keep up with the thick, heavy snowflakes, and the world outside quickly became a white blur. The headlights barely cut through the darkness, and soon enough, Sam could hardly see the road in front of him. He knew he was in trouble. He had been down this road plenty of times before, but everything looked different in the storm. The snow made it impossible to see where the road ended and the fields began. His phone had lost signal over an hour ago, and the radio was only static. "Come on, come on," Sam muttered under his breath, gripping the steering wheel tighter. He kept trying to convince himself that it would be fine, that he'd make it home soon. But soon the storm became too much. The snow was piling up too fast, and the truck's tires struggled to gain traction. The engine groaned, and then, without warning, the truck slid sideways and skidded off the road. It came to a sudden stop, sinking into the snowbank. Sam cursed, slamming his hand against the steering wheel. He tried to reverse, but the tires just spun uselessly in the snow. He was stuck. He put the truck in park, sat back, and tried to think. His breath fogged up the inside of the windows, and the only sound was the wind howling outside, pushing the snow harder and harder against the truck. After a few minutes, he realized he wasn't going anywhere on his own. The town was still a good distance away, but there was a small farmhouse nearby. He remembered passing it about a mile or so back, though he hadn't seen any lights on when he drove by. With no other options, Sam bundled up, grabbed his flashlight, and stepped out into the blizzard. The cold hit him like a slap in the face. The wind made it almost impossible to see or breathe, and the snow was already knee-deep. He trudged forward, his boots sinking into the icy ground as he headed back in the direction of the farmhouse. It was his only hope for shelter. The walk felt endless, the wind cutting through his layers of clothing, freezing him to the bone. But eventually, through the swirling snow, he saw it, the old farmhouse. It stood eerily still in the storm, dark and silent, almost as if it had been abandoned for years. But Sam knew it hadn't been. He'd seen people there before, though he didn't know them personally. When he reached the front door, he hesitated for a moment. Something felt off about the place, like it was waiting for him. The windows were dark, and there were no signs of life inside. Still, he had no choice. He knocked loudly on the door. No answer. He knocked again, harder this time, the cold starting to sting his skin. Still nothing. Sam frowned, then reached for the doorknob. To his surprise, it turned easily, and the door creaked open. He stepped inside, instantly relieved to be out of the wind, but the relief didn't last long. The house was colder than it should have been, and a strange, musty smell filled the air. "Hello?" Sam called out, his voice echoing through the empty hallway. No response. The house was old, with creaking wooden floors and faded wallpaper peeling from the walls. It looked like no one had lived there for years, yet everything inside seemed untouched. Furniture neatly arranged, family pictures on the walls, coats still hanging by the door. He called out again, louder this time. "Hello? Anyone home?" Still nothing. Uneasy, Sam walked further inside, his footsteps echoing unnaturally in the silence. The place was unsettling, but he didn't have much choice. He needed to get warm and wait out the storm. He found the living room and sat down in an old armchair, the cold still biting through his clothes. That's when he heard it, a faint creaking sound from upstairs. He froze, holding his breath. The sound came again, like slow, deliberate footsteps moving across the floor above him. "Hello?" He called out, his voice shaky this time. "Who's there?" No answer. But the footsteps continued, growing louder, closer. Sam's heart pounded in his chest. He stood up, looking toward the staircase at the end of the hall. He could see shadows shifting in the darkness, moving in ways that didn't make sense. His flashlight flickered, casting dim light on the steps. Suddenly, the creaking stopped, replaced by an eerie, heavy silence. Sam felt his skin prickle, every instinct screaming at him to leave. Then, without warning, the door to the basement swung open, slamming against the wall. Cold air rushed up from the darkness below, and a smell, something foul, rotten, hit him. Could hear whispering now, soft voices coming from the basement. Voices that sounded too close, too real. Sam stumbled backward, nearly tripping over the chair as he bolted for the door. He didn't care about the storm anymore. Whatever was in that house wasn't human. He yanked the front door open, running back into the blizzard, the cold suddenly feeling safer than what he had just witnessed inside. He never looked back as he pushed through the snow, praying he'd make it to safety. The farmhouse disappeared into the whiteout behind him, but the whispers, those faint, chilling whispers, stayed with him all the way back to the road. The village of Eldermere lay nestled between towering mountains and thick ancient woods, a place where the sun barely broke through the canopy of leaves overhead. Unlike the typical village, Eldermere was known for its unsettling stories, whispered among the townsfolk in hushed tones. Children were warned to stay away from the forest, especially after sunset. Tales of travelers who ventured into the woods only to disappear or return, changed forever, circulated like wildfire, instilling fear in the hearts of all who lived nearby. One rainy evening, a storm brewed ominously, cloaking the village in a shroud of darkness. Amid the rumbles of thunder, 3 friends, Ethan, Tyler, and Jacob, sat huddled in the dim light of a local tavern. The flickering candlelight cast dancing shadows on the walls, and the scent of wet earth wafted through the door as the wind howled outside. "Did you hear the story about the old man who went missing in the woods last year?" Ethan asked, his voice barely rising above the storm's roar. "Yeah, he was never found," Jacob replied, shivering involuntarily. "People say he heard voices, calling him deeper into the forest." Tyler rolled his eyes, dismissing the tale. "It's all just old wives' tales to keep kids from wandering off. We should explore the forest tonight. I mean, what's the worst that could happen?" Ethan and Jacob exchanged uneasy glances, but the thrill of the unknown called to them. They had grown up listening to these stories, and while part of them wanted to heed the warnings, another part craved the adventure. After a few minutes of deliberation, they decided to go. Gathering their jackets, flashlights, and snacks, they braved the rain and headed toward the darkened edge of the forest. As they crossed the threshold from the village into the woods, the atmosphere shifted dramatically. The air grew colder, and the sounds of the rain faded into an eerie silence, broken only by the crunch of leaves beneath their feet. Shadows elongated in the fading light, twisting and turning as if alive. "Are you guys sure about this?" Ethan asked, anxiety creeping into his voice. "Relax," Tyler replied, leading the way with confidence. "It's just a little rain. Let's see if we can find the old trail." The deeper they ventured, the more the trees seemed to close in around them, as if trying to protect some dark secret. The path became overgrown, obscured by brambles and vines, and an unsettling sense of being watched crept into their minds. Suddenly, Tyler stopped, shining his flashlight on a weathered wooden sign partially hidden by foliage. It read, "Cursed Grove. Turn back." Cursed Grove? Sounds like a fun place to explore, he joked, but his laughter felt hollow in the oppressive silence that enveloped them. As they pressed on, the atmosphere became increasingly oppressive. A low fog began to roll in, wrapping around their ankles and blurring the outlines of the trees. The once familiar sounds of the forest transformed into strange echoes and whispers, which seemed to bounce off the trunks. "Did you hear that?" Jacob whispered, eyes darting nervously. "Hear what?" Tyler asked, though he felt a prickle of unease creeping up his spine. "Voices, like they're calling us," Ethan added, his heart racing. But Tyler dismissed their concerns, pushing forward with bravado. "It's just the wind. Come on, let's see what's ahead." With each step deeper into the woods, a sense of dread settled over them. Shadows seemed to dart between the trees, and fleeting glimpses of movement in the corner of their eyes sent their hearts racing. Finally, they came to a clearing where the moonlight broke through the clouds, illuminating a large stone altar at the center, covered in moss and surrounded by ancient symbols carved into the earth. "This is weird," Jacob said, stepping closer to inspect the altar. "What do you think it is?" "I don't know, but it feels wrong," Ethan replied, crossing his arms tightly. Just then, a chill swept through the clearing, and a low whisper echoed around them, more distinct now. It called out, a soft yet sinister sound that seemed to beckon them closer. "Come, join us." "No way," Ethan said, backing away. "Let's go back now." But Tyler, drawn by curiosity, approached the altar. "This is fascinating. What if it's some sort of ritual site?" As he leaned closer, the whispers intensified, filling the air with a cacophony of overlapping voices. Suddenly, the ground trembled beneath their feet, and dark shadows emerged from the trees, swirling around them like smoke. "Run!" Jacob shouted, and they all bolted, terror gripping their hearts as they raced back toward the path they had come from. But the forest seemed to shift and twist, the way back obscured by thick fog and twisting branches. No matter how fast they ran, the shadows pursued them, their whispers rising to a frenzied pitch. Ethan could feel cold fingers grazing his skin, and every instinct screamed for him to escape. They stumbled through the dense trees, branches clawing at their clothes, but the path ahead seemed to vanish. The whispers morphed into screams, and shadows closed in, suffocating them with fear. Finally, as if guided by some unseen force, they broke through the trees and into the open, collapsing onto the ground in a clearing. They looked back, but the forest loomed ominously behind them, as if swallowing its secrets whole. Panting heavily, they tried to collect themselves, glancing at each other with wide eyes. The haunting whispers faded into silence, but they knew they were forever changed. They never spoke of that night again, but the experience lingered like a shadow in their hearts. The tales of Eldermere were no longer just stories to them. They had experienced the sinister truths that lay hidden within the cursed forest. If you enjoyed this chilling tale, please share your thoughts in the comments. Don't forget to like and subscribe for more spine-tingling stories.